December 20th, 1944. The train clattered across the frozen plains of Pennsylvania, its iron wheels screaming against the rails. Inside the boxcars, hundreds of German prisoners of war sat shoulder to shoulder, their greatcoats stiff with sweat and dust from weeks in captivity. They had expected America to be gray, exhausted, and rationed like Europe. They whispered among themselves that perhaps here, too, civilians queued for bread and coffee, that perhaps their captors, though victorious, were just as drained of resources as the Reich. Then they smelled it. At first, Lieutenant Klaus Richter thought it was smoke from the locomotive, a faint warmth carried on the December wind through cracks in the wooden walls. But the scent grew stronger. Sweetness, roasted grains, something rich and thick that clawed its way into their stomachs. Hunger made their imaginations cruel. Was this a trick? Was the U.S. Army piping in smells of food to break their morale? Richter pressed his ear to the boards and the sound reached him. Laughter. Not soldiers' laughter, not the sharp bark of men on guard. Children. When the train slowed at a rural crossing, the prisoners caught their first glimpse. Women with baskets stood by the tracks, waving at the guards. In those baskets were loaves of bread, thick-crusted and steaming despite the cold. One woman handed up a sack to an American sentry, and the man tore it open. Apples tumbled out, red as signal flares. The prisoners stared in silence. In Germany, an apple had become a luxury, something bartered for cigarettes on black markets. Here they were being thrown at laughing soldiers as if they were pebbles. Richter's stomach twisted. He tried to convince himself this was a show, a deception meant for their eyes. But then he noticed the detail that undid him. The American guard took one of the apples, bit deep, and handed the rest to a prisoner through the slats. The flesh dripped juice down the man's wrist. It was not a show, it was America. By the time the train reached Camp Swift in Texas, word had spread through the ranks of prisoners like wildfire. Some insisted the United States had hidden its hunger behind walls of propaganda, just as Germany had. Others whispered of impossible abundance. "They have no shortages," Richter heard a sergeant mutter as they disembarked. "Not even for us." The truth came in the mess hall. Steel trays slid across counters manned by indifferent cooks, and onto those trays fell portions no German had seen in years. Slabs of roast beef, scoops of potatoes drowning in butter, bread with crusts that crackled beneath the knife, coffee poured endlessly into tin cups. And there was milk, white, cold, unthinkably fresh. A silence fell over the room as the first prisoners sat down. Knives and forks hovered uncertainly above the food. It was Sergeant Vogel who broke first. He shoved a forkful of beef into his mouth, chewed once, and began to weep. He did not cry from fear, nor from homesickness, but from the violence of sudden memory. A Sunday dinner in Dresden, before rationing, before bombings, before his wife had begun slicing bread so thin that light passed through. The hall erupted in sound, spoons clattering, men laughing or cursing, some shoving food into their pockets as if it might vanish. Guards watched without comment. To them it was routine. To the prisoners it was revelation. The war was still raging across the Atlantic, but here, in the very heart of America, food was everywhere, limitless, unguarded, endless. And as Richter swallowed his first mouthful of cornbread, still steaming from the oven, he realized something that made the food turn bitter in his throat. Germany could never win against a nation that treated abundance not as privilege, but as background noise. America was fighting with more than weapons. It was fighting with the mathematics of plenty. The prisoners exchanged glances. For the first time, the possibility of defeat was not an abstract whisper, but a taste on their tongues. The night air in Texas was dry and cool, carrying the faint smell of mesquite wood from nearby ranches. The camp was quiet except for the distant shuffle of boots and the occasional bark of a guard dog. But inside the barracks, hundreds of German prisoners lay awake, staring at the ceiling planks above them, their bellies heavy with more food than they had seen in years. Some groaned from the sheer weight of it, others whispered in disbelief. "It is a trick," muttered Corporal Heinrich Schäfer, his voice sharp in the dark. "They fatten us like pigs before slaughter." "No," Richter replied from his bunk, his words heavy. "This is not theater. Did you not see the guards? They ate the same as us. And more. This is normal for them." That word normal hung in the air like a curse. The men had lived for years on meager rations back home. Watery soups, bread made with sawdust fillers, meat stretched with fat or absent entirely. Even officers received so little that hunger gnawed at their tempers. Yet here in enemy hands the tables groaned beneath food. If prisoners ate like this, what did American civilians eat? And their soldiers, how much stronger, how much better fed, how much more tireless were they in battle? The silence in the barracks thickened with unease. When dawn came, the prisoners marched to roll call, boots crunching on gravel. They passed by warehouses lined up behind the barbed wire. Wooden barns, tin-roofed sheds, and great concrete silos loomed like fortresses. Supply trucks arrived steadily from the rail line, stacked high with crates marked U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps. Guards barely glanced at the deliveries. It was routine, nothing special. But to the Germans, the sight was staggering. One truck unloaded sacks of flour, more than an entire German town might see in a month. Another carried sides of beef, strung up like hunting trophies, glistening in the sun. Barrels of apples rolled onto the ground, one splitting open, its contents spilling across the dirt. Prisoners watched as American soldiers kicked the fruit aside casually, some taking bites before tossing the cores to the dogs. The waste alone was a kind of violence. In Germany, women boiled weeds into soup. Children fought over carrot peelings. Here, apples spoiled on the ground, ignored. Inside the mess hall, the shock deepened. Breakfast was not the gray porridge they expected, but stacks of pancakes dripping with syrup, scrambled eggs by the bucket, bacon sizzling on hot griddles. Milk again, and coffee, always coffee, black and endless. Sergeant Vogel muttered under his breath, "This is how they feed their prisoners. Then what of their soldiers? What of their people?" His voice cracked, as if speaking the thought aloud might unravel his very sanity. The answer came soon enough. A group of American soldiers marched past the wire that afternoon, heading toward maneuvers. They were young, broad-shouldered, their uniforms clean and their steps brisk. Each carried a rifle and a pack filled not with crumbs but with cans of meat, bread, chocolate, and cigarettes. One soldier, grinning at the prisoners staring from the fence, tossed a pack of gum through the wire. It landed at Richter's feet. He picked it up and read the words stamped across the paper, "Spearmint, made in Chicago." Even gum was endless here. In Germany, such luxuries had vanished years ago. The prisoners began to argue. Some claimed it was American decadence, that such excess would make their enemy weak, soft, unprepared for the true hardships of war. But others, quiet, grim, saw the truth. "This," Richter whispered to Vogel as they watched the soldiers disappear into the dust, "is why we cannot win. They have more of everything, not just weapons, not just planes, more of life itself." At first the camp routine numbed them. Every day the same abundance. Lunches of stews thick with meat, bread still steaming, trays filled so high that many prisoners could not finish. Guards told them to leave what they could not eat. The trash bins outside the hall overflowed with food, bread crusts, uneaten potatoes, scraps of bacon. To the Germans it was obscene. To the Americans it was ordinary. One afternoon, Richter found himself staring at the trash heap, at a whole sandwich half buried in the dirt. His stomach, already full, twisted in confusion. He thought of his wife back in Leipzig, who had written to him of standing in line for hours to receive a handful of sugar. He thought of his mother, too old to trade for extra rations, likely surviving on cabbage broth. He closed his eyes. The vision of them, pale and gaunt, clashed violently with the reality of American prisoners turning away food because they had had enough. Later, when mail arrived, the contrast grew unbearable. Letters smuggled from Germany described hunger in every line. Bread rations cut again, coffee made from acorns, children fainting at school. A friend wrote of stealing beets from a farmer's field and being whipped for it. Meanwhile in the camp, a Red Cross truck arrived with parcels for the prisoners, parcels filled with chocolate, cigarettes, canned milk, and jam. The Germans could hardly believe it. Their own enemies were feeding them luxuries while their families starved. The conversations at night grew darker. Some muttered that Germany had been betrayed by its leaders, that the war was lost not because of courage but because of numbers, of factories, of harvests, of ships that crossed oceans like ants across soil. Others clung to defiance, insisting that America's plenty was hollow, that they would collapse under the weight of their decadence. But even those men stared too long at the overflowing plates in the mess hall. It was not only the food that stunned them, it was the ease with which it appeared. No ration stamps, no whispered exchanges on black markets, no gnawing anxiety about tomorrow. Just warehouses stacked to the rafters, trains arriving day after day, kitchens that never seemed to worry about shortage. The true power of America was not in the rifles slung across its soldiers' shoulders, but in the kitchens that fed them, the fields that supplied them, the factories that canned their meals by the million. For every German bullet, it seemed, the Americans had 10 sandwiches waiting in reserve. And that truth gnawed deeper than hunger ever had. The Texas sun was brutal that afternoon, a hammer of heat beating down on the camp. Dust rose with every bootstep, clinging to uniforms, coating the prisoners' skin until they looked like statues of clay. Yet the heat was nothing compared to the heaviness inside their minds. The abundance of food had settled into them not as comfort, but as a constant, gnawing reminder of everything they had lost. They were marched out to the work fields that surrounded the camp, rows of cotton and sorghum stretching beyond sight. The war had drained America's manpower. Farms needed hands and prisoners provided them. So the Germans bent under the same sun as Texan farmers, their sweat dripping into the earth. They pulled weeds, hoisted sacks, and picked bowls until their fingers bled. But what shocked them wasn't the labor. Many were used to toil. What shocked them was what they saw once the harvest wagons rolled in. The wagons were mountains of plenty. Cotton stuffed to the brim, wheat sacks so full that 2 men strained to lift them. Chickens squawked in coops, fresh eggs stacked in crates. And after the day's work, instead of exhaustion leading to another night of thin rations, the prisoners were rewarded with food, always food, endless food. That evening the mess hall unveiled something new. Meatloaf as wide as the trays themselves, mashed potatoes drenched in gravy, and corn on the cob slathered with butter. Pies, too, apple, peach, and pecan, steaming and golden. The smell hit them first, warm and intoxicating, curling under their noses until their bodies ached with hunger they thought had long since been numbed. Vogel stood frozen in the line, staring as the cook carved another thick slice of pie. "In Germany, I once fought a man for half a potato," he whispered hoarsely. "And here they give us dessert." Some prisoners laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. Others crossed themselves, as if standing before a miracle. When they sat down, Richter looked at the pie cooling before him. He hesitated, the fork trembling in his hand. In his mind he saw his daughter, thin as a reed, eyes hollow. He remembered her last words before he was sent away. "Papa, bring bread when you come back." He had kissed her forehead, knowing he could not promise. And now here he sat, across an ocean, staring at more sugar and flour in one slice than she might see in a month. He ate because hunger commanded it, but each bite felt like betrayal. The guards noticed their astonishment, and sometimes they teased. "You boys look like you never seen pie before," one Texan drawled, laughing as he lit a cigarette. "No," Richter muttered, his English halting but firm. "Not like this, not ever." The guard only shrugged, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And perhaps for him it was. At night the barracks buzzed with arguments. "It is propaganda," Sheffer snarled. "They feed us like this so we forget we are prisoners. They want to make us soft." Richter shook his head. "Propaganda does not fatten pigs. Look at the warehouses. Look at the fields. This is not theater, this is reality. You sound like a defeatist, another hissed. I sound like a man who has eyes, Richter snapped. But he said no more. He could feel the despair creeping like a shadow through the ranks. Weeks passed and the cycle continued. Work in the fields, food in the hall, letters from home, and the endless comparison between what was and what could never be. One day, a group of prisoners was assigned to unload a new shipment from the rail line. They expected weapons, uniforms, maybe spare parts. What they saw instead broke something inside them. Car after car opened to reveal canned goods stacked from floor to ceiling. Spam, corned beef, beans, fruit cocktail, evaporated milk. The labels were bright, colorful, almost cheerful, with smiling faces and sunlit farms. The prisoners stood dumbstruck as American soldiers formed chains, tossing crate after crate with ease, laughing, smoking, humming tunes as though the work were nothing. A corporal beside Richter muttered, "One train for food alone. Back home, one train carries weapons, coal, soldiers. But here, they send a whole train for food." "And tomorrow, another," Richter whispered back. He felt it deep in his chest, the immensity of it, the bottomless ocean of American supply. By autumn, the prisoners were given heavier coats, gloves, and hats. Winter in Texas was not brutal, but the Americans prepared anyway. They prepared for everything. Thanksgiving arrived, and though the prisoners had only a faint idea of the holiday, they soon understood. That day, the mess hall became something out of legend. Turkeys roasted until the skin was crisp and brown, their scent filling the entire camp. Mountains of stuffing, rivers of gravy, cranberry sauce gleaming like jewels, rolls still steaming from the oven. Pumpkin pies, pecan pies, whipped cream piled high. And the Americans insisted the prisoners eat their fill. For many, it was too much. Some Germans laughed until tears rolled down their faces. Others cried silently into their plates. "It is obscene," Vogel whispered, though his mouth was full. "They treat us better than our own treated us." Scheffer slammed his fist onto the table. "It is not kindness. It is dominance. Do you not see? They can afford to waste food on us because they have more than they know what to do with." And perhaps he was right. That night Richter lay awake, staring at the beams above him. He realized that the war, the battles, the bombs, it had all been decided long before he set foot in Texas. It was decided in these warehouses, in these kitchens, in the soil of American fields. Germany could build tanks, yes. They could train soldiers, yes. But war was not just steel and fire. War was bread. War was butter. War was pie on a plate when your enemy had nothing but cabbage water. And in that war, Germany had already lost. The cold crept into the barracks with December, though Texas never knew the kind of winter the prisoners once endured back home. Still, the nights were sharp, and frost sometimes dusted the barbed wire at dawn. The men bundled themselves in army-issued coats, grateful for their warmth. Yet the chill in the air seemed nothing compared to the frost that had settled into their conversations. Because by now the food was no longer a curiosity. It was an open wound. The shock of arrival had faded. The astonishment at pies, butter, and roast meat had dulled into routine. But with routine came something more dangerous, comparison. And comparison, for men whose families were starving across the ocean, became torment. Richter sat on his bunk one evening, the latest letter from his wife unfolded in trembling hands. He read each word slowly, as if forcing himself to endure the pain. "The ration cards are almost useless. I waited 5 hours for bread, and when my turn came, they gave me half a loaf, mold already at the corners. The children cry at night from hunger. Little Liesel is sick, and the doctor says she needs milk, but where can I find milk?" He stopped there, his throat closed, his eyes stung. The letter went on, but he couldn't read it. Around him the barracks were quiet except for the rustle of paper, the crack of boots shifting on wooden planks, and the low murmur of men whispering the same words again and again. No bread, no coal, no milk. Then, as if mocking those letters, the camp siren wailed, not for danger but for dinner. The smell reached them before they reached the hall. Roast chicken, stuffing, peas with butter, slices of soft white bread stacked high in baskets. That night Richter didn't eat. He couldn't. He pushed the plate away and walked out under the stars, standing by the wire fence as if staring east might shorten the ocean. Vogel found him there, silent, his fists tight against the cold. "They don't know," Richter muttered finally. "The Americans. They don't know what it means to fight for a crust of bread. They don't know hunger." Vogel said nothing. He only stared at the stars, wondering how many more winters Germany could endure before collapsing. In the weeks that followed, tempers began to fray. Some men refused to eat, as if fasting could prove loyalty to a distant fatherland. Others gorged themselves, ashamed but unable to resist. Some stole rolls from the mess hall not because they needed to, but because they wanted to hoard what they could not send home. Arguments broke out in whispers and shouts. "You're a fool to trust this food," Scheffer spat one night, jabbing a finger into another man's chest. "Every bite you take is a nail in Germany's coffin." "And what then?" came the furious reply. "Shall I starve here while my stomach growls and food is thrown in front of me? Shall I prove my loyalty by wasting away while the Americans laugh? You betray your country." "No," Richter interjected sharply, rising from his bunk. His voice was low, but it carried. "Our country betrayed us. Look around you. They feed their enemies better than Berlin feeds its children. That is the truth." The barracks fell silent. No one dared challenge him. They all knew it, but hearing it aloud felt like treason. Christmas arrived, and with it, a crushing display of abundance that none of the prisoners could have imagined. The Americans decorated the mess hall with pine branches and lanterns. A gramophone played carols, strange melodies in English, yet hauntingly familiar in rhythm. And then came the feast. Turkeys, hams glazed with honey, mountains of potatoes, rivers of gravy, baskets of rolls, dishes of cranberry sauce, and desserts beyond counting. Pies, puddings, cakes iced thick with sugar. The prisoners ate in silence at first. Some laughed nervously. Some wept openly. One man put his head down on the table and sobbed as if the weight of every letter from home had broken him in that instant. Richter looked around and thought, this is how empires win wars, not with bullets but with bread enough to share. That night he couldn't sleep. He thought of his wife and children shivering in the cold, waiting hours for half a loaf of bread. He thought of the camp kitchens here, where trays of leftovers were scraped into bins, wasted. He thought of the soldiers guarding them, well-fed, well-clothed, certain of victory. For the first time, he wondered not whether Germany could win, but whether it had ever stood a chance at all. January brought new work assignments. Some prisoners were sent to nearby farms to help mend fences, gather eggs, and butcher livestock. What they saw there was worse than any humiliation in the camp. One farm they visited had barns so full of corn that rats burrowed into the piles, gorging themselves. The farmer cursed at the waste but shrugged. There was always more corn. At another farm, milk was poured into buckets until it sloshed over the sides, soaking into the dirt. And in one unforgettable moment, Richter watched as a farmer tossed perfectly good loaves of bread to his pigs. "Bread," Richter whispered, his voice hollow, "for pigs." The farmer looked at him, puzzled, then laughed. "They fatten quicker on bread than on corn. Nothing goes to waste here." But to Richter it was worse than waste. It was sacrilege. His daughter's face flashed before him, thin, pale, begging for bread, and he saw pigs munching contentedly instead. He turned away, bile rising in his throat. That night he told the others, and outrage swept the barracks. Some shouted, some cursed, some fell into bitter silence. The food that had once been miracle and comfort was now poison. As winter deepened, a strange transformation took hold. Pride fractured. Belief cracked. Men who once spoke with steel in their voices now sat in corners, hollow-eyed, whispering about farms where pigs ate better than children. Letters from home continued to arrive, filled with despair. A wife wrote of selling her wedding ring for a bag of potatoes. A mother wrote of burying a son too weak from hunger to survive the flu. A brother wrote of stealing coal from a train to keep his family from freezing. The prisoners read these letters while their bellies were full of turkey, bread, and pie, and the shame of it burned hotter than hunger ever had. Then came the moment that would linger in Richter's memory long after the war ended. A new shipment arrived at the camp, a convoy of trucks loaded with supplies. Among them were sacks of flour stacked like white mountains. An American guard, grinning, tore one open to check, and flour spilled into the wind, dusting the ground like snow. Richter watched in silence. Flour, enough to feed a whole German village, scattered carelessly into the dirt. He bent, scooped some into his hand, let it run through his fingers. He imagined his wife kneeling over a bare table, praying for flour, and here it was, wasted in a gust of wind. The barracks went silent. No one dared answer. The letters from home grew darker with each passing week. Richter's wife wrote of scouring the woods for roots and bark to boil into soup. His neighbor in Bremen sent word that 2 children had died of starvation in their street, their bodies stiff by morning. Another letter spoke of entire trains of refugees from the east, swollen with hunger, crowding the cities and begging for food that wasn't there. The men read these words while butter gleamed on their bread, while syrup dripped from their pancakes, while they spooned sugar into their steaming coffee. And that contradiction, being full while their loved ones wasted away, ate at them more cruelly than hunger ever could. One day, a truck brought in a load of oranges. The prisoners stared as the crates were opened, the fruit glistening under the pale winter sun. Oranges. To many of them it was like seeing treasure. For years back home, citrus had been nothing more than a memory, reserved only for children at Christmas, if at all. The guards laughed and tossed a few to the prisoners, who caught them awkwardly, stunned by the generosity. Richter held one in his hand, its skin bright and firm, the scent sharp and sweet as he tore it open. Juice ran down his fingers as he bit into it, and for a moment he forgot the war, forgot the hunger letters, forgot everything except the shocking sweetness bursting on his tongue. Then the moment soured. He thought of Liesel, his daughter, pale and sick in a cold house, her lips cracking for want of milk, her tiny hands reaching for food. He imagined giving her this orange, watching her eyes light up. The thought crushed him. He couldn't finish. He set the half-eaten fruit down on the table, staring at it as if it were an accusation. By February, something stranger began to happen. The abundance no longer amazed them. It no longer even angered them. It broke them. They ate their meals in silence, heads bowed, not daring to look at each other. No one spoke of victory anymore. No one boasted of the Reich's invincibility. The arguments had faded into quiet resignation. The food had killed their illusions. Some turned bitter, muttering that Germany had been betrayed by its leaders, by its generals, by its propaganda. Others turned inward, broken by shame, unable to reconcile the fat of America with the bones of Europe. And some, like Richter, began to wonder, not only about defeat, but about the future. If this was what America could do to its prisoners, what would it do to the world once Germany was gone? In March, another work detail took them to a rail yard. There, they saw something that would forever sear into their memories. A train had arrived, not of prisoners, but of supplies, coal, grain, canned goods, all bound for ports where ships waited to carry them across the Atlantic. The sheer scale was staggering. Hundreds of cars stretching farther than the eye could follow, each loaded to the brim. One of the American overseers, a sergeant with a cigar clamped between his teeth, clapped Richter on the shoulder. "All this," he said, gesturing to the train, "is just 1 week's shipment to Europe." 1 week, Richter asked, stunned. The sergeant grinned. "Next week there'll be another, and another. Hell, we'll keep sending trains till the Germans run out of railroads. The words sank deep. 1 week's shipment here was more food than an entire German province had seen in months, and it was only a fraction of what America was sending. Richter's hands trembled as he worked, loading crates. He knew then with certainty, Germany's defeat was not in the battlefield. It was here in these endless trains, these endless warehouses, these endless fields that poured out food like rivers. The war had never been about armies alone. It had been about bread, and America had more bread than the world. When they returned to camp that night, the men were quiet. No one sang. No one argued. They ate their supper, beef stew with soft white rolls, in silence, every spoonful tasting like ash. Later, as Richter lay awake, he heard Vogel whisper from the bunk above him. "It's over, isn't it?" Richter didn't answer. He didn't need to. They both knew. Spring came, and with it the final collapse of illusions. The news filtered in, piece by piece, from guards and newspapers that sometimes accidentally found their way into the camp. The Ardennes offensive had failed. German cities were burning. The Allies were across the Rhine. The Red Army was in sight of Berlin. The men read these headlines with hollow eyes, their bellies full of bread and meat, their hearts empty. The food no longer shocked them. It had broken them months ago. Now it was just another reminder, every bite an echo of defeat. Richter thought often of his wife's letters, of Liesel's thin face, of the bread fed to pigs, of the flour spilled into the dirt. Those images would never leave him. And as he lay awake one night, listening to the steady rhythm of breathing in the barracks, he realized something. The war would end soon, but the memory of this, of the endless American food, would haunt them all longer than any battle.